Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is a really profound cultural shift that's been reshaping American higher education for a while now. This move away from the university as a place of, let's say, intellectual risk, what we might call the free space, toward one that really prioritizes emotional comfort and security, the quote-unquote safe space. And this tension, it really became undeniable during those controversies at Yale University, nearly a decade ago now. We can almost pinpoint the philosophical clash with the 2015 Halloween email incident. You had an administrative committee suggesting students avoid potentially offensive costumes, citing the need for sensitivity. And then Erica Christakis, a faculty member, she challenged that, defending the value of intellectual freedom, the messy process of learning, the necessity sometimes of making mistakes. And that disagreement it exploded really into a much larger institutional crisis. So the central question we really need to tackle today is foundational. What is the sort of engine driving force behind this cultural transformation? Is it the institutional mechanism itself, the administrative bureaucracy, or are deeper, maybe external forces like prevailing ideology, student consumerism, and, generational change, the actual root causes? I'm going to argue that the administrative bureaucracy is the central suffocating factor here, actively prioritizing its own image over genuine inquiry.
Yeah, I come at it from a slightly different angle. While I absolutely agree that university bureaucracy is often, bloated, self-serving, sometimes even toxic, I see it fundamentally as an enforcer. It's the mechanism, sure, I grant you that, but it's not the origin. For me, the true primary drivers are these deeper ideological and generational demands that create a kind of mandate for safety. And the bureaucracy, it then services and manages that mandate. I think we really need to look outside the administrative suite to find the source of the pressure.
Well, my position is that the self-serving university administration, it's become the single greatest structural threat to intellectual life on campus. These bureaucracies have frankly ballooned to such a size that their dominant priority now seems to be stability, public image, and crucially, institutional self-preservation. And this often comes at the direct expense of genuine education and discovery. The system inherently rewards risk aversion. I mean, if you eliminate controversy, you eliminate risk, right? And administrators get those internal accolades, maybe promotions. And we saw this bureaucratic imperative so clearly in that Yale Law School case involving the student Trent Colbert. Colbert sent this, what seemed like a lighthearted, satirical invitation to a potluck party using the phrase trap house party, a term borrowed from hip-hop culture.
Now, Deans Eldick and Cosgrove, they didn't exactly encourage dialogue about, cultural appropriation or misunderstanding, did they? They acted explicitly as moral enforcers. They pressured Colbert really intensely to apologize, using this potent threat that his reputation and his career could suffer if he didn't comply. They even offered to write the apology for him. That, to me, is just crystal clear evidence of administrators proactively wielding institutional power to demand compliance, to control the narrative, prioritizing a smooth institutional image over a student's right to intellectual freedom or even just honest discussion.
Yeah, that's a powerful indictment of administrative overreach, I agree. And the Colbert incident, it absolutely exemplifies how compliance gets enforced. However, I would frame the causality differently. Why does the administration feel so empowered to intervene in that specific, quite aggressive way now? I think it's because it is responding to and enforcing these profound cultural demands that originate externally. The bureaucracy in this view is more of a symptom, not the primary disease, if you will. And the clearest evidence of this external demand for me came during those protests against Nicholas Christakis, Erica's husband, which followed that whole Halloween email debacle. Remember, one student was actually captured on video yelling at him, "It is your job to create a place of comfort and home for the students." That single quote, I think, is incredibly profound. It demonstrates a fundamental, almost generational shift in what students expect the social contract of higher education to be. The university, for a significant portion of the student body, it seems, is no longer viewed primarily as a challenge incubator dedicated to intellectual confrontation. It's seen more like a service provider offering a secure, maybe even therapeutic environment. And furthermore, this expectation gets amplified by two really powerful external drivers that bureaucracy is, well, almost designed to serve now. First, you've got the university increasingly treating students like customers. This is that neoliberal shift people talk about, prioritizing consumer satisfaction, sometimes over challenging intellectual growth. And second, we see an academia that is, let's be honest, often dominated by specific ideological frameworks that encourage students to view society primarily through lenses of oppression and privilege, which can fuel this kind of moral policing. So you have modern students often raised in very protective, maybe affluent environments, bringing with them this demand for emotional safety and inclusion. And the administrators, well, they simply fulfill that demand to manage institutional risk and, frankly, ensure customer retention.
Okay, I see why you emphasize the external demand. I really do. But I worry that viewing the bureaucracy as just a mere enforcer kind of dismisses the fundamental structural power it holds, almost independent of student appetite sometimes. The bureaucracy doesn't just respond, it actively enables and, I'd argue, amplifies the shift to a really dangerous degree. If the administration hadn't grown so enormous, and if its priorities weren't so fixed on minimizing PR risks, it probably wouldn't intervene so aggressively, even if some students were demanding safety. Let's just clarify the philosophical stake here because it's important. True education, I believe, requires intellectual risk, and often that includes the freedom to offend, because offense is sometimes the necessary cost of honestly testing a controversial idea. It's the bureaucratic fear of controversy, driven by this institutional incentive structure, that prohibits this core lesson. The structure itself is the problem, because it incentivizes administrators to act against the core mission of the academy. Think about it. A dean who successfully squashes the Colbert controversy is probably seen internally as managing risk effectively, safeguarding their career path. But a dean who defends intellectual freedom in that situation, they risk institutional chaos, maybe career stagnation. So the student ideology might provide the justification for censorship, but it's the bureaucracy that provides the structural mechanism and, crucially, the self-interested motivation.
I'm sorry, but I just don't entirely buy that the structural growth of the bureaucracy happened in some kind of vacuum. We have to look at causation here. The bureaucrats, they only seem to create these problems and justify their expanding jobs because the underlying cultural and ideological structure allows it, even demands it. If the faculty and the vast majority of students still held to that, let's say, pre-1990s consensus that learning through discomfort was paramount, administrators just wouldn't have the leverage or the mandate, frankly, to override freedom of expression and academic standards in this way. The key change, the thing that precedes the bureaucratic reaction, is the shift in values held by the student body. The bureaucracy is, in many ways, simply responding to the new market reality, the student as a protected customer who demands a certain kind of service, and that market mandate, it comes from outside the administrative office.
If the demand for safe spaces wasn't already so prevalent and, importantly, ideologically supported, the administrators wouldn't have the moral or, let's face it, financial leverage to intervene in the really complex, costly way they did in both the Christakis and the Colbert cases. It's fundamentally a management response to a cultural requirement that's already there.
But that line of reasoning brings us directly to what I see as the most damaging consequence of this bureaucratic action: the infantilization of students. Nicholas Christakis, in that infamous exchange on the quad, he correctly asserted, I think, that his role was to help students learn and grow intellectually, to help them navigate discomfort and disagreement, not to actively shield them from it. The administrative priority of comfort and control, which is driven by risk management, directly undermines that genuine educational purpose. And the result? I fear it's a loss of resilience and critical thinking skills among students. When deans step in to mediate a, arguably lighthearted email conflict, or offer to actually write an apology for a student facing criticism, like they did with Trent Colbert, they are sending a really clear and, I think, destructive institutional signal. It's basically saying you are too fragile to handle disagreement or offense or negotiation on your own. This practice, it just destroys the goal of fostering independent critical thought and maybe the humility that's required to learn from one's own mistakes. The focus shifts entirely from developing intellectual resilience to maintaining procedural compliance.
And that reinforces this idea that the university is a place of forced conformity, not courageous discovery.
That's a compelling point about the tragedy of infantilization. It really is. But have you considered that the administration might view its role through the lens of, well, necessary institutional stability? Precisely because of those shifting expectations you mentioned. The conflict shows that both the traditional academic perspective, freedom, and the newer student perspective, centering safety, now claim legitimate moral grounding, at least in the eyes of many. So when students view free expression not just as offensive but as actively insensitive and harmful, the administration feels compelled to step in. They have to manage the conflict, maintain institutional stability, and yes, that often means prioritizing public image over academic principle, partly because the student body itself seems increasingly prone to public, sometimes hostile confrontation.
The bureaucracy is in effect trying to stabilize an environment where a public, hostile confrontation with a professor, like we saw in the Christakis protests, is now a thinkable, even actual reality. This shift in the tone, the lack of deference maybe, in student behavior, that's a profound generational change. And the bureaucracy is attempting, however clumsily or heavy-handedly, to contain it. It acts like the safety valve, because the pressure, the moral and ideological demand for comfort is building up primarily from the student side, from those external cultural shifts we talked about.
That position remains pretty firm, though. While these cultural forces and ideological shifts certainly provide the context and maybe the justification, the ultimate operational threat to critical thinking, to discovery, to intellectual freedom, it is the self-serving institutional structure. It's the bureaucracy itself that prioritizes conformity, public image, and its own internal hierarchy above all else. It's that administrative framework that ultimately holds the veto power over intellectual freedom on campus. And it seems to use this power primarily to serve its own institutional need for stability and, yes, continued expansion.
Yeah, and I would conclude that while the administrative mechanism is undoubtedly highly problematic and often quite inept, the fundamental transformation of higher education is really a complex interplay. The ideological framework, the consumer mentality, the generational demand for emotional comfort, these provide the necessary fuel, the mandate for the bureaucratic machine to prioritize safety over intellectual challenge. Without that powerful external demand, I just don't think the administrative machine would possess the moral or the financial justification for its current level of sometimes suffocating overreach.
Yeah, I think what the material we've discussed today clearly illuminates is how both these structural flaws and these quite overwhelming cultural priorities have perhaps combined forces to erode genuine learning and rigorous debate in our universities.
Right. Leaving the listener ultimately to consider which force, the structural administrative rigidity or that powerful cultural demand for a different kind of university experience, really bears the greater responsibility for the current, often uncomfortable state of higher education today.